Americans are afraid of their government, and for good reason. Government agencies have taken extraordinary control of our land, food, home, and our money. What is even more frightening is the coercive control the government is taking over our children, the most precious relationship we have on this planet. Education, medical care, and even possession of your child is under the close scrutiny of agencies that monetize our children. Connie Reguly and Cynthia Becker are bringing you real-life stories of the trauma and destruction of an agency meant to protect children from harm, CPS. Child Protective Services operates in every state and has the power to take your children on anonymous allegations even without investigating and without giving you a day in court. Let's get started.
Hi, everybody. Good morning still here in California, and good afternoon in Connie's side of the world.
Yes, good afternoon from Tennessee.
Yes. Gary and I are from California, and so I'm Cynthia, and I'm one of the hosts of Exposing CPS, Families Tell All. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about my CPS story. I'll let Connie be the main host of today, asking questions, and then our guest is Gary Rayleigh from California as well. Gary, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Gary Rayleigh. I'm a marriage and family therapist. I've been licensed for 31 years. I've also been a court administrator for 15 years in Riverside County in California. And prior to that, I was with social services in Orange County, California for 9 years. And prior to that, I worked with kids in group homes and foster care. And so I've had a blessed life.
Wow. Yeah. So I will say I'm adding up all of those years because I'm trying to figure out if you're about my age. And I would say, yeah, you and I are probably living in about the same decade. So so thank you for joining us today. I have for 30 years tried to help families through this very complex system called CPS, primarily in Tennessee, but also across the country after having developed a social media platform and a grassroots effort to make some major changes. I'm real excited to have somebody here today who's working with families from a different angle than what I have worked with them. And of course, I know a little bit about Cynthia's story, but I want to kind of just like dig in and sort of let her share it from the perspective of how she got through it. And then maybe you can use that as well to tell us what you've seen with families as they're struggling with this, how you're helping them, and then maybe just tidbits that you can impart to Cynthia and I as we interview other families, because that's what our goal is right now, to get families to speak out and tell their story. And, for us, even, whatever we can do for them, whether it's encouragement, whether it's direction, whether it's suggestions, but certainly from the aspect and the level of what your knowledge is and your expertise, we would love to have some tidbits or suggestions to help. So Cynthia, why don't you kind of start off of how, in your story, Gary worked with you, and then we can kind of go from there.
Absolutely. So, in 2015, I, at that time, had been married for 10 years and became very ill. And December of 2015 was the start of my health journey. And from that date till now, I've had 130 surgeries in this 8-year period. And in 2017, I had found out that my husband of 12 years then had been on meth. and I've never been around anybody on drugs, not even really an alcoholic. I've never partied or anything, so it was all quite a shock. And so all at the same time I often refer to my story as a Job story from the Bible, because all at one time, my health goes out the window. I'd been on hospice 3 different times. And now I'm finding out my husband is on meth and also is informing me that he's found somebody else and he's going to make it work with her. And in the middle of all of that, on a hospital visit, my girlfriend's outside in the garage putting the car seats, hospital garage, from the car seats from my car to her car, while my mother illegally and wrongfully walks out of the hospital, kidnapping my children. And I wasn't even informed until that evening when I got a text message from a social worker saying I cannot see or talk to my kids until a court hearing. And if you're anything like me and you're a parent in the rose-colored glasses world, you have no idea that CPS really exists. You have no idea what your rights are. And you have no idea that they can literally take your children based off of an allegation, true or false, and keep them from you. And now you're in a fight and a battle on your own to try to win and get your kids back. So that's where my story starts. And it's been a horrific events. And even though my case has been closed now for 6 years, I did end up getting my children back. CPS is currently back in my life and back to harassing and threatening. So that's the start of my story. The way that I met Gary was a month into it. So when CPS opens your case, again, not knowing any of this, they often give you a case or safety plan, which is them telling you things that they give you a laundry list of things to do, telling you you have to go to therapy, individual, and then group therapy. And then in my case, I had to go to parenting classes, and as a victim of domestic violence classes. Oftentimes I'll also add, rehab or drug and alcohol counseling. And then also because I was threatened of being on drugs, I was accused of being on drugs. I had to then go to random drug testing. Luckily, the therapist that they sent me to during all of this was Gary, and Gary played a huge part in my whole case. So not only was he my individual counselor, therapist, he also did my parenting classes within a group, and then remained my therapist and is still very involved in mine and my children's lives.
Yeah. And so Gary, and I don't know, as we sit here today and you being Cynthia's therapist, I'm sure she's open to, relieving you of privilege. However, at any point that you feel, that as a professional, because I know as a lawyer sometimes, and I go on, I talk about sort of an experience with somebody's case, there's at some point where I say, I probably shouldn't go any further. So please, that's totally your discretion. But, if you would kind of right now, since Cynthia has shared that, sort of talk about where you found her and what you realized as a professional you need to do and how you sort of walked her through that process.
Well, yeah. So step by step, I saw your introduction that plays when we came on. And one of the statements in there is that without investigation, so CPS can take certain services. And technically, back when I worked for CPS, it ceased to be CPS in California and became emergency response, and various counties call it a variety of things. So one of the things that people out there in each different state, it has its own, we call it vernacular, words, and what do they mean. And when I was the supervisor of intakes in Orange County in the 70s, um, the answer to that question is no. There was an investigation, there had to be an investigation, and there had to be a filing of a petition that had some reason that to believe that the minor was in danger, imminent danger. And so it was a different time and way that things were processed.
Mm-hmm.
Now people make allegations, and there are sometimes actions by social services. And from their perspective, they would argue that it is out of caution while they figure out what's going on, because some situations are very complex. And just to share it, it wasn't accidental that Cynthia was referred to me. I'm an independent licensed therapist, but I also worked for a nonprofit organization that had a contract with the county to provide services. And when they got a case that was convoluted, confusing, and the other therapist within the organization did not know what to do with it, that became my referral. So Cynthia was one of those.
I refer to it, Gary, as a red case file, where it's just like my health, very complex and confusing, and nobody wants to deal with it.
And so one of the things that Cynthia is aware of now that she wasn't at the time is the part of her story that she shared with you regarding her husband and his drugs and her health issues and etc. Also, beneath that was a life of living with her mother and father, and the family system was a mess, convoluted, confusing, caused her to have certain beliefs and understanding, thinking that the world was a certain way, and it wasn't that way. And so the working that Cynthia did on herself with my help was going back and trying to work through erroneous beliefs and confusing understandings about how this world is in relationships.
Yeah.
Tennessee's laws are very similar to California's, but there are a lot of states where it's different.
Yeah. So I want to interject right here. So in my world of attorneys who are not therapists and we're merely trying to get down to logistics, sometimes we look at people like Cynthia and call them a hot mess. So is that kind of where you would say she was at the time?
And she, to her credit, has been through processes dealing and learning how to deal with this, how to think about what it is that's happening. And the problems that she has with CPS now is that because she has a history of there being some reports, now they jump to conclusions.
Right.
And unfortunately, CPS no longer requires that there be a presentation of at least a preponderance. And so as an attorney, I'd let you explain. In California, there are levels of evidence. And for CPS to go out and intervene initially only requires that there be a preponderance of concern about the health and safety of
Oh,
the
yeah.
minor.
Well, and it's
Then
even,
when you have a hearing where it has to raise to another level, and you never get to everybody knows about beyond a reasonable doubt
mhm.
because it's on every television show and all kinds of dramas about criminality, but that doesn't apply to the decisions about children.
No, it does not. And it's actually even lower than that. It's really probable cause. The very lowest level is what's called
Probable
reasonable
cause to do that
suspicion.
initial action.
Yeah. I mean, the very
Yeah.
lowest level of a legal standard is called reasonable suspicion, and that's all a police officer has to have to stop you on the street, right? And to ask you questions is reasonable suspicion. And then that next level is probable cause, and probable cause is what we're supposed to have to be able to issue a warrant on somebody and actually to even bring a petition. And I don't want to get too sideways about my whole arguments about these standards of proof, because you're here as our guest and I want it to be your time. But the right to parent is a constitutional right, and that family integrity is a constitutional right. And they hold that a parent's right cannot be interfered with unless there is at least clear and convincing evidence, which is higher than a preponderance of evidence, lower than beyond a reasonable doubt. To me, and having been in the system and buried in the system for so long, it's all subjective, right? It's all like, I don't even know what that is. It's like, at least with meat, when you're supposed to cook your meat to a temperature of 165, you can stick a thermometer in it, right? But I don't know the difference between preponderance of evidence and clear and convincing and, beyond a reasonable doubt. They're almost so hard to decipher. But they remove children on probable cause. And as an attorney, I have always had a problem with that. And they keep them on probable cause. And it may take months and months and years before the parents ever get to that final trial where that proof right is lifted. But so, and like I said, I could go all for an hour on that, and you don't want to hear me talk on it. So you have Cynthia presented, and thank you for sharing that. And that you considered her, you really were looking not just at her situation as it appeared to you right then, but as a therapist, what you were able to do is when you wanted to start unpeeling this, you went back and really got into the relationships with the family and how
Mhm.
the complexity of that. Because as an attorney, of course, I see that as well, right? Where I've had cases similar to Cynthia's where parents, relatives steal the kids and we're trying to undo it. But at the situation that you were at, I'm so glad you were able to start to uncover that. So thank you for letting me interject and go ahead.
And so Cynthia signed releases and allowed me to talk with the social worker. And so I was able then to also provide the service of being a therapist that wasn't biased in her favor, but knew the system and how the laws related to child custody and visitation, et cetera, all of those kinds of things worked. And as a result of that, I could speak the language to talk with her social worker about what is the concern, how can I address that, or is it something that I can't address? And if so, then where do we get that? Because social services is responsible for having a reunification plan during those initial times. And they are supposed to be able to specify that this will be done, that'll be done, this will be provided for the children, that'll be provided for the parents. And that goes to exactly what you were saying, is that all the way to the Supreme Court, from the time I worked in social services till now, the Supreme Court has said parents have an inherent right to their children. But the system screws that all up, twists it all up, and it doesn't actually then get done that way. So during the 15 years that I was a court administrator, I saw there is a difference, even if you're talking about criminal cases, there is a difference between the law and the administration of justice, it's called, at least in California. Administration of justice is, when does a police officer have reason to put hands on someone or cuffs or etc. All of those kinds of things. And at least in California, the district attorney office files charges based on what they wish they could prove if they had the evidence that they thought they might get,
Yes, I
as
hear you. I
opposed to
know
what
that
they
story
have
too.
evidence for.
Right. Yeah. Well, I know Cynthia probably hasn't had time to give you a lot of my history, but they totally criminalized me on a fake crime that they made up to be able to shut me up. And that whole gig is falling apart on them. But yes, they definitely, and I see it with parents all the time. I mean, Cynthia and I had already spoken to Miss Johnson, and they just make up things, right, to impugn them.
So I'm not sure how many people you have watching out there, but Cynthia has had several people that came onto her show that told their story in Florida, in Tennessee, in Kentucky, and all across the United States. And so we know, you and I have seen and heard, that one of the problems is social workers go out and they expect people like Cynthia to be able to talk with them and reason with them and work on developing this reunification plan. Well, Cynthia didn't know how to do that. She had grown up in her family with her mom and others in her family, and in an environment where she had learned to get her needs met by other means than speaking with people like this, And so one of the things that she was willing to work with me on, and some people are not, and some people that are not are often using marijuana and or stronger drugs or alcohol or both, or other ways of not having to look at themselves. And so the thing that I could do with Cynthia, because she was willing to, was we could work on issues that a lot of therapists do not address. And so one of my biggest complaints isn't just about attorneys. Everybody takes shots at attorneys and jokes, it's like, how can you tell that the person who ran over an attorney knew that it was an attorney? And it's because there's no skid marks.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let's not get on attorney jokes, because I have a few of my own. Like, what do you have on the beach when you have 100 attorneys buried up to their neck in sand? Not enough sand. However, if I speak badly of the system, they come after me and they say I'm interfering with the administration of justice if I say bad things about them.
Well, and so therein lies having to be able to speak various languages, and you're quite good at it. And so Cynthia and I were able then to work on her showing and displaying those underlying strengths and ways, changing her way of thinking. Now, when social services knocks on her door, she says, just a moment, I need to call my attorney.
Yeah.
But most people don't have an attorney. And even if they did, they would think, oh, this is going to be an expense. I don't know if I can call and get this kind of service. And so it isn't something where you have a right to an attorney. The so-called advisement that is given to people, you have a right to an attorney, Yeah, right. Kind of
Right.
in the
Yeah, not all the
administration of
time, very
justice.
rarely. Yeah,
Yeah.
so let's talk a little bit more about that interplay between you and Cynthia kind of specifically if you don't mind. And Cynthia, kind of between you and Gary, like from where you started from, what are some of those things, and kind of have a little bit of that discussion if you don't mind, because I want somebody watching this who's a hot mess like Cynthia was back in 2015, and her children are stolen, and they're being ordered to get psych evals, which honestly, I'm just going to tell you, Gary, everybody that says they've ordered me to get a psych eval, they get scared to death. They don't want to do it, because they're afraid that that'll also be subjective. They've already been treated poorly. And so, as an attorney, I actually prosecuted domestic violence before I became an attorney, and I've worked with a lot of domestic violence victims. And every time my domestic violence victim has to go get a psych eval, I know exactly what it's going to say. It's going to say she has high anxiety, paranoia, and she appears histrionic, right? Because that's what domestic violence victims look like when they do an MMPI, right? So if you would, kind of have an exchange with her, and sort of, if you were talking to somebody else, another parent in this place, you and Cynthia kind of help them through that process.
So, yes, when Cynthia came, we needed to then return to her memories and get step by step what happened between her and her mother, her and her father, when she needed someone to explain to her what to do, what not to do, then who could she go to
Well,
that would help her be able to be successful and effective?
and that's a couple things that I did not realize. And just so people understand, I went from living within four walls, and my parents had me very sheltered. My mom's way highway, mom's always right. Um, when I went to Gary, and I still do it, but very, like, I would dissociate. And so I would, and for people that don't know, basically, you get like triggered to a memory or a time, and you're there versus here in the present. And so even like talking about these things, my brain will still draw me back to those moments and things like,
Can I jump in for a
yeah.
second? Right at that point, you just hit upon a key factor that is a problem for Connie, which is that when the system, social workers, refer people to see a therapist, almost every therapist from here to Tennessee and all other states these days are trained in cognitive behavioral therapy. If you are into cognitive behavioral therapy, I don't know if on screen you want me to bring up, but there is the ACEs assessment. There are the personality traits assessments. There are all of these things that those therapists know how to do, that if that's what I had done with Cynthia, I would have just known what she had that was an indication that she likely would be having a problem parenting, because those things, that the way that she had been raised and those things that had been done with her caused her to think and have emotions that was trauma. So if you go to a therapist referred by social services, if the therapist does not work with you on doing trauma assessment and what and when and how, and work on that or identify that, if indeed it's present, then that therapist is taking you to the legal level, but not to the quality level that a therapist should take you.
So is that considered trauma focused therapy?
Yes, by people who know what they're doing. But my criticism, you know, I joke about therapists now. Um, my criticism of people in my profession is that they don't make as much money that way.
Mm.
They make more money by staying on the easy to point out and deal with cognitive behavioral therapy
Mm-hmm.
that is at this level, but they don't want to get into something harder.
Mm-hmm.
And in California now, therapists that use telehealth, which came as a result of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're talking about the last few years, the pandemic has driven how courts do things.
Mm-hmm.
And so the telehealth makes it more difficult to do the level of therapy that I'm talking about. And so as a result of that, fortunately, Cynthia and I saw each other before the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was face to face. And she'd come walking in with her tubes coming out here and all those things.
And
But
just
she was
in case
willing to jump in.
people don't know, and I don't know, Connie, if you knew, but for 7 years I lived with a G tube, which is a gastrointestinal tube, and then a J tube, which is your jejunum tube, because my whole digestive system shut down. And then I also have a port to access for treatments like chemo and blood infusion, iron transfusion, or blood transfusion, iron infusion. So different things, and that's how I lived for 7 years. I still have my port that I'm even currently access to, right now, because I just had my chemo treatment yesterday. But everything in my life was a mess. And what I was
physical health problems are known to be related to people who have had trauma problems.
Yeah, for sure.
And all of my diagnoses in 2015 were idiopathic. We have no idea why you have this. And it all started getting resolved and solved when my own daughter, in the care of my mom, was given heavy doses of medication to reduce her, how do I even say it, like activity level, Gary? Is that?
Yeah, that she was considered to be having hyperactive responses. And she went to a different therapist, not me. I previously had been face to face with families and kids, hundreds in Orange County, and had a different way of thinking about when to use medication and when not. That currently a lot of therapists don't have. And as a parent, you need to be an advocate for your child to try to build the strength within them to be
for sure.
successful.
Yeah.
But there are times when I would actually support at least medication for a period of time until we work on building some strength.
Yeah. So how long from the first time you met Cynthia, and I don't know if there's a way you measure, if you have kind of like thresholds with somebody that you can kind of measure when they've reached a certain threshold of understanding or coping skills, but kind of tell us like that is with that process of when you could see that she was coming to light or being able to deal with it differently. Go ahead.
What I was looking for from her was for her to be able to talk about and relate her experiences and what she now thinks that was caused by, and is it a good thing for her to be a parent and use that approach or not. And if she is able to identify the emotions as well as the thoughts that are positive parenting, then she will be able to give reasons. And so I have various assessments and questionnaires, and pose a question like this. When she told me her daughter was being put on medications because she was diagnosed as being ADHD and therefore was hyperactive, and there
And the
was
meds,
concern about on the spectrum autism. There are a lot of therapists that make an error out there in assuming that developmental conditions and problems that have occurred are indications of being on the spectrum. Because if you diagnose a kid as being on the spectrum, then that alleviates certain things and get certain services through the school. And again, we're talking about the administration of how things are done in America, which often are not correct.
Right.
so a couple things. Number one, my daughter wasn't, just because Gary knows, but my daughter wasn't given ADHD meds. She was given extremely high prescribed doses of Benadryl to calm her down,
Anxiety meds.
which is not anything you give to a child with ADHD. And how they were prescribed, I don't know. But like I was saying, most of my diagnoses were then coming out that could have been possible poisoned or something by my mother as a child. So what I had been saying was, when I first went to Gary, I asked him a question. I said, do you think I'm going to get my children back? And I think every parent asks that. And his answer is what literally shook me into a different way of thinking. And he said, by the way you think and the way you handle situations, no, I don't. And he said it's possible you could, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Most of the time, they only give you about 6 to 8 weeks of therapy. That's like the norm, I believe. That's what I've heard from other people. But when Gary offered to give me 2 times a week, super intense therapy for as long as I need it, I jumped on that. Number one, whenever he gave me any assignments for homework, which were optional, I made sure I did it. I was literally in constant communication, and I had to, you know how when you go to a doctor and you break a bone, the first thing that they do is re-break your arm or whatever to then correct the placement of the broken bone. And that's exactly what we had to do in therapy. I had to break everything I knew growing up, all the ways of the world that I thought was how people existed, communicated, thought, and had to proceed with even disciplines. I had to break. And I'm still to this day and learning more about myself and the reality of how you live in life. Even Connie, the Bible. My mom had me raised thinking this way about the Bible, and that you can do this, and how God is a punisher and disciplinarian and not the God of love. And, that's just one small example, but a big one in my life today. So going to him, I had to take everything that I was taught, break it all apart, and then relearn it. And not just relearn it in the world, but the way I needed to live as a parent to my own children.
So here's the question that comes to my mind. Again, is not having a therapy background, but a legal background. But I do tell full disclosure here. I did do my master's program in psychology before I went to law school. So I tell everybody I have just enough psychology to be dangerous. But so I'm like, how? And I'm thinking about where Cynthia was. She's lost her children. She has significant health issues. Her family's fallen apart. As a CPS worker, I'd say she is like a classic. She's like a classic TPR case. She's like a classic. We're going to get these kids, separate her. She's going to continue to deteriorate because now we're just going to dump all this other anxiety on her, which is, one of my big complaints. But I'm like, okay, so she goes to the therapist, and how do you get to that? Where do you go in that inquiry? Now, based upon what she said, as you told her, if you continue to think the way you think, you're not going to succeed. But then how do you peek over that wall? I mean, how do you go, okay, here's where we are, and it's a mess. It's horrible. You're thinking screwed up. You're, this is when attorneys go, I can't deal with you. I mean, I'm just going to be honest. That is one of the biggest problems that attorneys and client relationships break down in CPS cases, is because attorneys cannot do it. We can't do it. Although I love survivors. I'm so proud of Cynthia. I'm so proud of moms that do. But how do you get there?
You as an attorney need a person who has reasonable assertive skills. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people who were in Cynthia's situation at that time, she had submissive skills. Mm. She was not the assertive person that you've met now. She's worked on becoming that. And that was one of the key ingredients about her potential for being able to be the parent her kids needed. The other, especially with the husband, and she's going to have to deal with a drug abusing former husband. And so she had to be able to develop the necessary skills. And yes, that trauma treatment style is one of the first things that a therapist could do. Another is to help them work on reconciling disconnects that they have. Mm-hmm. And depending on how that has been processed in the patterns of thinking in the brain, I don't know if Cynthia remembers, but I remember the session that we had where I purposefully was not respectful or considerate of her, to see if then she would challenge me, if she would, tell me, no, I shouldn't do that. I should do this, And so as the therapist, I knew that I needed to have her be able to step up. And when she could be like that with me, but a lot of therapists don't want you to be assertive and independent and recognize your feelings and express those. So to her credit, and to the credit of a number of other people that you've had on this show, the grandmother that you had from Florida a couple of weeks ago was, her story was absolutely, this is how you should be to be able to be the person for your kids, grandkids in her case.
I remember, Gary, hitting that spot of learning to protect myself. Because you're right. Like, even again, back to the Bible, learning to be submissive, it was taken to the extreme. And I went from, again, living with my parents to then getting married at 19. and I married a narcissist. I married my mother, basically. And that person was, very, you're going to submit to me. So never could argue or stick up for myself for anything. And when I learned that I was allowed to have a voice and I could say something, I did take it to the extreme for a little while, especially in a, relationship, because I was, nobody is going to disrespect me again. Nobody is going to try to tell me what to do. So now I am, remarried, and again have my children back. So we're a family. And I'm back to being able to be, a submissive wife in a good and loving way, but to a point of, but these are my boundaries, and that needs to be respected as well. So I feel like there's a much more healthier balance in my life when it comes to all of this, but it took a while to figure it out.
So my suggestion, Connie, to you as an attorney, yeah, you get people that are a hot mess, and you would like for them to work through that. But in California, that's not going to be necessarily the person that your client gets referred to by social services.
True.
And so there's going to need to be work between the client and the therapist that challenges the therapist to do the work that is. And so I just ticked off a DA in Rancho Cucamonga court here the other day when she said, I obviously was saying that this client is now got the skills, knowledge, and abilities and has demonstrated those in this way and in that way. And the prosecutor, this is a criminal case, prosecutor says, you're clearly biased in favor of this client. And I said, no, I advised the client when we did the intake that I will always be biased for the best interest of children. I told Cynthia that too. At the time I first see somebody that's referred, that's involved with social services, because of my background and history and what I do, I know that I am biased in favor of what's best for children.
Well, and I will say, I want children to have good parents. And to me, good parents is people who can take you to adulthood. And I mean, I've parented children, and I'm not 100% the best parent in the world. I mean, I know I made plenty of mistakes, but when we're dealing with, and as I grow Family Forward and I'm working with other nonprofits, I mean, I know that not all parents are great parents, and I want people to be better parents. It's a challenge. It's difficult. It's 24/7. It's exhausting. It's stressful. It's, that sweet little baby we have, and we look at them as they lay in our lap is just really like, oh my gosh, I mean, I now have a responsibility, and I say parenting does not end at 18. You're lucky if you can make it to 35 and, cut some strings. But, so, I want people to be better parents. And so, I don't know, as we kind of wrap up here, like, what do we, and you may say, like, this is like asking me like this big, broad legal question and asking me to summarize it. But as we deal with these parents that are in this place, what do we tell them, or should we be asking them these questions? Like, maybe, the way you're interacting, or perhaps there's trauma that you've not resolved that is going to be helpful to you to get through this. And, I got to be careful. I can't play the psychologist, of course, but even in these situations, I can't really play their lawyers. So, what do we is there any magic words we can say to parents if we see, or just generally, what do we tell them? How do we get them to a place where they have that desire to be a better parent?
So what you are wanting to do is ask them some questions that will give you some information so that you know if they are having a history of trauma or other kinds of experiences that are getting in the way of their being the parent that their children need. And the answer to that is for you to ask them to tell you what they learned to do, because learned patterns of behavior tend to repeat through a lifetime. And that's true for me. That's true for Cynthia and you. And you know that. And you've worked on changing some of your patterns because they didn't work for you. And Cynthia changed a whole lot. And I changed some. And so we all do that. And so you could present to your client, we all have times. I had 2 sons. Ask me about 2 or 3 times that I was not the father that they needed. I can remember those. My first master's was in developmental psychology. And so I have a lot of understanding of developmental evaluations. And at least here in California, you can go online to a state organization. And I know Missouri has the same thing. You can go online in almost all the states, and Tennessee has it, if I'm not mistaken, where people can take parenting questionnaires and look at their answers and see what they know how to do and what are concerning. And there's a lot of information. One of the advantages of having the internet, the web in the world, is you can use it for people that are willing to use it.
True. Absolutely.
Your problem, my problem, is when they won't work with me, really. They'll say they do, but then they'll leave me and they'll go drinking or doing drugs or back with their people that are in that pattern of behavior that is not what their children needs.
Right.
Especially males. It's still true in our society. I know we're supposed to not be sexist and think that there's any bias, but the truth is, as a male growing up, I learned different patterns of how to be a parent than Cynthia did as a female. And so how do you then develop those skills that her children need from her now?
Right.
One thing I can say for me that was extremely helpful. I'm the kind of person that when I watch a movie, I will actually look up what happens online before I watch the movie. I don't like surprises. I like to be prepared, especially if it's a horror film, okay? My husband hates that about me. Like, not, you know what I'm saying, but he hates that I do that. Because we'll watch the same movie and I go into it knowing, or I'm asking a billion questions during the movie. And that's one thing I feel so thankful for from Gary, is that he sat down with me and prepared me for any and everything I could possibly experience with my kids. And so far, he was spot on. So when I call him, I'll be like, hey, Gary, remember when you told me I was going to go through this? Well, it's happening. And, you told me this and this and this, but I need a refresher. So that's like, I still use his guidance and wisdom in life now, because I don't have a mom or dad I can call up to ask these questions.
Yeah, so important. So important. I mean, I will say, Gary, that's one thing. Oh gosh, I hate to make too broad a generalizations myself, but I would say with all of the cases where there's been CPS families involved, there is a consistent problem with those adult parents not having good relationships with their parents as adults,
Mm-hmm.
where they feel like they can do that, right? Like, I mean, my daughters love it or hate it. I mean, they'll come to me. Sometimes I think I've just about driven them crazy and they may not call me again, but I lay it out for them, and that yet I try to maintain that relationship. And so often I see that we don't have that anymore. I mean, I was very close and again, you and I are close to the same age. I mean, my grandmothers were, especially on one particular grandmother, she was somebody, I didn't talk to her a lot, but I had her there to ask questions about, or my mom could ask her questions about. And so it's relative. There's some relativism to having those communications within the family structure, right? And then
Absolutely.
when you
Yeah.
lose that, and I think we've lost that a lot in our country, we're losing something,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially the kids that, like we always talk about the children that have grown up in foster care and aged out or not. Number one, I feel like I'm living that same type of life. They don't have, some of them are lucky to have, but they don't typically have that relationship that has prepared them for the future. That's why the majority of the kids who've been in the system have a target on their back. So when they have kids, then it's used against them because they grew up in the system and they didn't have that relationship. They don't have that support. So it's crazy to me. And yeah.
And our world is so demanding on you. It was much easier for me to raise my sons when there was no web in this world that my daughter could then expose herself on because
Yeah.
she was getting threatened at school, etc. I mean, the things that we deal with now couldn't have happened when
No.
my sons were young. But my grandchildren, who are now all college age or older, um, had to deal with a lot of that. But they had me and my
Yeah.
wife and my son and my other son and etc. We
When I,
made sure that they had that.
yeah,
And
when
some churches are pretty good about promoting
mhm.
that. Some churches are actually a problem.
Yeah, my
Cynthia
children
could
are.
actually use Bible stories with me because I got my bachelor's degree before my master's at Cal Baptist University here in California.
Oh, wow. Great. Yeah. So my children who are
And
adopted and
so
they're
spirituality and
I don't
religion
think
was
he's
something
hearing
that
the.
she could use.
yeah. Yeah. So, and just as kind of related to that, my children, they're adults now, but they were adopted when they were young children, and one of my girls was having some problems as a teenager, and she ended up getting us involved in juvenile court, and of course, because of who I am, they thought they'd give me more grief and give me a harder time, and I had some. I had to fight back with some pretty hard fists, but ultimately, when we had this hearing, when I got a special judge on it, and I was talking to him, and here's what I told him. I think you'll appreciate this, because they're believing my daughter. She's 16, 17, whatever. And I just says, Judge, I said, let me tell you something. 10 years from now, when my daughter's 25, 26, 27 years old and she's having a baby, or she's getting married, or she's getting divorced, or she has a car wreck, or she can't make her car payment, she's not going to call y'all. She is going to be, her file is going to be shredded by the time she's that age. And if you destroy my relationship with her in this courtroom, it will affect her for the rest of her life.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, and I said it with that voice too, because I have seen it over and over and over, where these juvenile court systems, demonize the parents and affect the parents so grossly that there's no way the children can restore those relationships.
So the root of all evil, or the root of evil, money. The administration of justice has eked its way into the juvenile as well as criminal, as
Yep.
well as family law, probate, etc. Unfortunately, you got to look at how does this pay, where,
Yep.
how,
That's so
because
true.
that's America. And that's
That
one
is.
of the benefits for some people, problems for others.
Yeah. Well, we are ready to wrap up. And Gary, thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, maybe we can have you back sometime, or we may even have some parent who's brave enough to jump on a program with you and us, and where you can perhaps give them at least just some tidbits of how to move forward. But thank you so much for sharing and for working with all these families all this time.
And he actually, just so people know, he does do that on Thursdays with me. He co-hosts with me, and he helps parents through, I don't want to say mental issues, but the mental issues of dealing with CPS.
Yeah, for sure.
But I love it when she brings on, like, the grandmother that I mentioned. And I just kind of sat here and went, oh, lucky grandkid. I didn't say much at all that day.
Yeah.
Maybe 2 sentences, because what people were hearing was what she is doing. And she did what you did, even though she's not an attorney. She went into the court and said, I'm going to be there this time and that and forever.
All right. Yeah. Gary, thank you so much for joining us. So we will see everybody next week.
All right. Very good. Thank you so much.
Okay.